Samia Shahid had finally escaped a life of control and fear. But when her father Farooq Shahid and cousin Kamran Qureshi learned she had returned to Pakistan in secret, a dark plan began to unfold, one so brutal, so calculated, that detectives would call it the most disturbing case they had ever seen. The call came just after 2 a.m. A shaky voice reporting strange sounds from the house next door. The caller, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, told the emergency dispatcher that she had heard loud crashing, screaming, and then sudden silence. When the police arrived at the quiet suburban street, the house at the end looked no different from any other. The porch light was off, the windows closed, the gate slightly ajar. But inside, the scene was a different story. The officers entered the home and were immediately struck by the disarray. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out, photo frames shattered across the living room floor. There were drag marks on the wooden floor leading toward the hallway. At the end of the corridor, the door to the master bedroom was half open. When they stepped inside, they found Samia Shahid lying face down beside her bed, her body twisted unnaturally. The room smelled faintly of blood and something metallic, maybe from a tool or weapon. There was a deep gash across the back of her head, and her legs bore strange, uneven burn marks. Her left arm appeared broken, bent at an angle that suggested a struggle. One of her earrings had been torn from her ear. The other was missing entirely. The responding officer immediately called for backup and a forensics team. Paramedics confirmed what was already apparent: Samia was dead. Her body was cold to the touch, stiff with early rigor mortis. But what unsettled the first responders more than anything was the expression on her face. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and nothing appeared stolen. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, untouched. Her laptop was on the dining table, open to a blank document. A single wine glass had fallen over, and a bottle of unopened water was on the floor. This didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Detective Arman Kaleem was assigned the case and arrived at the scene an hour later. He had seen his share of homicides, but something about this one felt deeply personal. He carefully observed the condition of the room, taking note of the broken hairbrush, the scratch marks on the wall, and a faint handprint smudged near the light switch. In the adjoining bathroom, a damp towel lay crumpled in the sink, tinged slightly with blood. Whoever had attacked Samia had not just wanted to kill her, they wanted to punish her. Dr. Lina Qureshi, the lead forensic pathologist, joined shortly after sunrise. She examined the body where it lay, noting the signs of prolonged physical assault. The injuries weren't just random. They followed a pattern: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, ligature marks around the neck, and multiple burns that looked to be made with a household appliance. Dr. Qureshi concluded preliminarily that Samia had suffered for hours before she died. Her death wasn't quick, it was calculated and merciless. Meanwhile, the officers began their preliminary investigation. Samia's neighbors were questioned. Most said she was quiet, polite, and usually kept to herself. She had only recently returned to Pakistan from the UK. She was seen jogging alone in the mornings, sometimes coming home in the evenings with groceries, always alone. One neighbor remembered seeing a dark car parked outside her home earlier that day but didn't recognize the driver. Another claimed she had heard arguing a few nights prior, but dismissed it as a domestic issue. Inside Samia's bedroom, her personal diary was found open on the nightstand. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. In it, she mentioned feeling watched, like someone was following her. She wrote about having nightmares and being afraid to sleep. She didn't mention names, but there was a line that stood out: "I feel like they're waiting for the right moment." As the body was transported for a full autopsy and the crime scene cordoned off for deeper forensic analysis, one thing became clear to Detective Kaleem: this was not a random act of violence. Someone had come here with purpose, rage, and time. And whoever it was had vanished into the night without leaving behind a single clear fingerprint. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the beginning of something much darker, the investigation into Samia Shahid's murder quickly shifted focus from the scene of the crime to the people in her life. In just a few hours, her name spread across news channels and social media, triggering public outrage and questions about who could commit such a horrifying act. Detective Arman Kaleem began with the basics: family, friends, work, and past relationships. Every detail had to be examined with care because the brutality of her death suggested personal motives rather than a random attack. Her best friend and co-worker, Rosie Noor, arrived at the police station early that morning after hearing the news. Shaken and tearful, she told detectives about Samia's troubled history. Samia had once been married to a man named Imran Fazil, a volatile and possessive individual. Their marriage had lasted only 2 years, marked by emotional and physical abuse. Razia claimed Samia had tried to file for divorce multiple times. But the process was long and filled with threats from Imran and interference from her own family. Eventually, Samia fled to the UK and cut all contact with her ex-husband. There, she rebuilt her life. She started working at a women's shelter, helping abuse victims, and eventually married Rahil Dar, a Pakistani-born artist based in Manchester. According to Razia, this second marriage caused a deep rift between Samia and her family, particularly her father, Farooq Shahid. Farooq, a man rooted in strict traditional values, never approved of Samia's decision to divorce or remarry, especially someone outside the family's control. Razia recalled that Samia was constantly worried her family might one day retaliate. This information gave investigators 2 immediate leads: Imran Fazil and Farooq Shahid. Detective Kaleem requested background checks and travel records. Imran, now living in Karachi, had a criminal record for domestic violence and threats made against Samia after their divorce. However, CCTV footage placed him at a university seminar on the night of the murder, with time-stamped photos and testimonies to support his alibi. Still, his DNA being found under Samia's fingernails couldn't be ignored. That detail bothered Kaleem. It was the kind of clue that either meant Imran had been at the scene, or Samia had come into contact with something, or someone connected to him very recently. Attention then turned to Farooq. A respected businessman, Farooq had always maintained a public image of dignity and faith. But behind closed doors, things were different. Neighbors described him as stern and controlling, especially with his daughters. Farooq had reportedly returned from Saudi Arabia just 2 days before the murder. His passport confirmed the trip. Oddly, no one could account for his whereabouts between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. on the night Samia died. When questioned, he claimed he was home alone, sleeping, and didn't even know Samia had returned to Pakistan. That was a lie. Samia's phone records, accessed through a court order, showed a call from an unregistered number the day before her death. The call lasted under a minute, and her last message to Razia read, "I think they know I'm back." Investigators traced the burner phone used for the call to a shop in Lahore. Surveillance footage from the store was unclear, but the timestamp revealed the phone had been purchased only days before the murder by a man wearing a cap and mask. Payment was made in cash. Another odd detail surfaced. Samia's second husband, Rahil Dar, had contacted Lahore authorities just a week prior, asking for welfare checks on his wife after she stopped responding to messages. He said she'd left the UK abruptly, claiming she needed to settle things back home. Her tone in emails had changed. She sounded nervous, unsure, and even asked Rahil not to contact her for a few days, for safety reasons. All these threads pointed to one thing: Samia had feared for her life. She had known something was coming, but nobody realized how close the threat truly was. Her murder wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, deliberate, and deeply personal. And while her father and ex-husband both denied involvement, the clues burner phones, surveillance gaps, and her own final writings suggested otherwise. The deeper investigators dug, the more they began to suspect that Samia's killer was not a stranger, but someone who had once claimed to love her. The forensic team worked tirelessly, sifting through every inch of Samia Shahid's home. Every object, smudge, and fiber could hold meaning. While the front door showed no signs of forced entry, the back entrance had a small smear of blood on the door handle, barely visible unless closely examined. A partial fingerprint was recovered, but incomplete, not enough for a clear match. The living room yielded a more valuable clue. A small metallic object, lodged under the sofa, turned out to be a damaged SIM card. It didn't belong to Samia's known phone and had likely been broken intentionally. Investigators sent it for data recovery, hoping something usable could still be extracted. Dr. Lina Qureshi finalized her autopsy report 2 days later, and what she found shocked even the most seasoned officers. Samia's injuries were not the result of a single violent act. They were sustained over a prolonged period, likely several hours. Multiple contusions showed repeated impacts. The burns were consistent with a hot iron applied deliberately to her skin. There were clear signs of ligature strangulation, and traces of a sedative were found in her bloodstream, commonly used to temporarily paralyze or render someone unconscious. The combination painted a disturbing picture. Samia hadn't just been murdered. She had been tortured. The sedative raised immediate red flags. It was not an over-the-counter drug, but one usually administered in medical settings. This narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. Someone with access to medical supplies or knowledge of pharmaceuticals was likely involved. Detective Arman Kaleem followed up with local pharmacies and medical supply vendors, and eventually discovered a purchase order made under a false identity for that same sedative. The buyer had used cash and provided minimal identification, but store CCTV caught a blurry image of a man in a lab coat with a covered face. Around the same time, the digital forensics team managed to extract fragments from the broken SIM card. They uncovered several deleted text messages and 2 saved voice notes. The texts were short but revealing. One message read, "She lands Sunday. We do it Monday. Be ready." Another, "No mistakes. No mercy." The voice notes were distorted, but a female forensic audio specialist was able to enhance one enough to recognize a word, Shahid. That sealed the suspicion that this was not a robbery or random attack. It was organized with multiple people involved, and it had been planned for days. Detective Kaleem returned to question Samia's cousin, Kamran, who worked at a local clinic. Previously dismissed as irrelevant, Kamran now became a person of interest due to his access to sedatives. When interviewed again, Kamran appeared nervous, his story inconsistent. His alibi for the night of the murder was weak. He claimed to be home watching television, alone. A search warrant was issued for his residence and workplace. At his apartment, officers found an empty vial of the exact sedative found in Samia's system. They also found a pair of gloves hidden in a laundry basket, one of which had traces of dried blood. When confronted with this evidence, Kamran broke. In a quiet, emotionless tone, he admitted he had helped someone subdue Samia, though he insisted he didn't know she would be killed. He claimed he was manipulated and pressured by Farooq Shahid, Samia's father. According to Kamran, Farooq had promised him a promotion in the Clinic 1, funded through family-owned medical investments, if he played a small part in a private family matter. Kamran claimed Farooq had already made all the arrangements. He just had to bring the drugs and wait for the signal. Farooq's involvement now seemed far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Not only had he lied about his contact with Samia, but he had used his influence and family connections to enlist others in a premeditated murder. Yet Farooq remained calm when brought back in for questioning. He denied everything and asked for a lawyer. No confession came, but the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. What had once seemed like a single act of violence was now unfolding as a conspiracy of honor, betrayal, and cold-blooded planning. And the most chilling part was that the story still wasn't over. As the investigation pushed forward, the discovery of Kamran's involvement cracked the case wide open. But while Kamran had confessed to playing a part in the events leading up to Samia's murder, there were still gaping holes in the timeline. He insisted that he had only delivered the sedative, slipped it into a bottle of juice left on Samia's porch, and then walked away. He claimed not to know what happened after that. But Detective Arman Kaleem wasn't convinced. Too many details were left unexplained, and Kamran's story changed slightly every time he repeated it. The turning point came when police analyzed security footage from nearby streets. At first glance, the camera position 2 blocks from Samia's house didn't show anything of interest. But when the footage was slowed down and enhanced, a shadowy figure could be seen entering her home's side gate around 11:37 p.m. The figure appeared to be wearing gloves and carrying a small black duffel bag. 30 minutes later, another person, larger and broader in build, entered through the same gate, this time holding what looked like a crowbar wrapped in cloth. Police were able to trace the vehicle parked a few houses away. The license plate belonged to a rental car registered under a fake name, but paid for with a debit card. The account was linked to none other than Farooq Shahid's company. Investigators now had physical presence, financial connection, and motive, all pointing toward Farooq. The final piece arrived unexpectedly when digital forensics recovered messages from an old email account belonging to Samia. One of the emails, saved in her drafts folder and never sent, was written the day before her death. It read, "I'm being told to meet Baba alone tomorrow night. Something doesn't feel right. If anything happens to me, start with him." This was more than suspicion. It was a posthumous accusation from the victim herself. Investigators revisited Farooq's phone records and found multiple calls to Kamran in the days before the murder, many of which were short and placed during odd hours. They also uncovered a second burner phone hidden in Farooq's car, stored beneath the backseat carpet. On that device were more messages with short instructions. Prepare. Bring gloves. Don't leave anything behind. Still, Farooq remained silent under questioning, refusing to acknowledge any connection to Kamran or the phone. He sat calmly during interrogations, often closing his eyes and refusing to speak. He was cold, measured, and without remorse. But the walls were closing in. Kamran, facing the possibility of life in prison, agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. He revealed the full plan. According to him, Farooq viewed Samia as a disgrace for leaving her arranged marriage and marrying a man of her own choice. In Farooq's mind, her actions had brought shame to the family. She was unfixable, and her death was the only way to restore the family's lost honor. Kamran said Farooq orchestrated every detail: when to drug her, what tools to use, how to wipe away evidence, and even which route to take when fleeing. Samia had apparently been lured into a sense of false security. Farooq had promised to meet her alone to talk things through and make peace. In reality, he arrived with gloves, a cloth soaked in chloroform, and a cold plan for vengeance. When she collapsed from the sedative, Farooq allegedly unleashed all his rage. What followed was hours of calculated cruelty. One detail stood out above all others. Kamran said that before leaving the house, Farooq had placed Samia's diary back on the nightstand and opened it to the last page intentionally, as if daring someone to find it. As if, in his twisted logic, he believed that the world would understand, maybe even agree with what he had done. But the world did not. The public was outraged. Protests broke out, demanding justice for Samia. Her story resonated with many women who lived in fear of similar fates. Detective Kaleem knew that this case had become more than just a murder. It was a symbol A brutal, raw, and unflinching look at what happens when control and tradition are used as weapons. The pieces were finally in place for an arrest. But even as the handcuffs clicked around Farooq's wrists, there was one haunting thought left. Behind, if Kamran hadn't spoken, if the digital traces hadn't survived, Samia's voice might have vanished forever. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists filled the benches, cameras lined the steps outside, and protesters held placards demanding justice for Samia Shahid. What had begun as a mysterious and brutal homicide had grown into a national conversation about honor, control, and the terrifying price some women pay for independence. At the center of it all stood Farooq Shahid, expressionless in a neatly pressed suit, as if the weight of the evidence meant nothing. To him, the prosecution laid out its case with precision. They presented the autopsy findings, the surveillance footage, the recovered text messages, and most damning of all, the testimony of Kamran. He took the stand reluctantly, but spoke with a quiet conviction. He detailed every step of the plan, the instructions Farooq gave him, the delivery of the sedative, and the chilling calmness with which Farooq orchestrated the events of that night. Kamran's confession was backed by physical evidence, including the gloves with Samia's blood and the sedative vial found in his apartment. In his testimony, Kamran recounted how Farooq believed Samia had shamed the family by divorcing her first husband and refusing to return home. He had described her as ruined and defiant. When Kamran asked why he couldn't just disown her or cut off contact, Farooq's answer had been chilling. Some wounds can only be healed with silence. He meant death. The defense tried to shift blame, suggesting that Kamran had acted alone and was now pointing fingers to reduce his sentence. But they struggled to explain the burner phone, the payment trail linked to Farooq's company, or the draft email Samia had written implicating her father. The jury listened in tense silence, every new piece of evidence a nail in the coffin. Of Farooq's defense, he never showed emotion, not once. Not when Samia's final diary entries were read aloud. Not when the photos of the crime scene were displayed. Not even when Kamran broke down in tears on the stand. Samia's husband, Rahil Dar, traveled from the UK to attend the trial. In a brief statement, he described Samia as a loving, kind woman who had escaped abuse only to walk into another trap. He said she had dreams of starting a shelter for women like herself. Her death was not just the end of a life, it was the silencing of a voice that wanted to make change. After 4 weeks of intense proceedings, the jury returned with its verdict. Farooq Shahid was found guilty of premeditated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted not in applause, but in quiet, emotional relief. Some wept, others simply nodded. Justice had taken time, but it had arrived. Kamran received a reduced sentence of 15 years due to his cooperation. He would serve time, but his testimony had made the conviction possible. The prosecutor later described Kamran as a man caught in the grip of fear and family loyalty, but not beyond redemption. He had chosen, albeit late, to do the right thing. Outside the courtroom, a mural of Samia Shahid was unveiled days later on the wall of a women's shelter. It showed her smiling softly, eyes lifted toward the sky. The shelter was named Samia's Light, and it quickly became a refuge for women escaping violence, secrecy, and oppression. Her story, though born from tragedy, began saving lives. Detective Arman Kaleem, reflecting on the case months later, admitted it had changed him. Not just because of the horror, but because of the silence that had surrounded Samia. She had tried to warn people. She had written about her fears, sensed the danger, and still walked alone into it. Kaleem now lectured at police academies, emphasizing the importance of listening to the faintest signals victims leave behind. Samia's grave bore no epitaph. Just her name, her birth and death dates, and a small line etched at the base. She dared to live freely. In a world that punished her for that freedom, her story refused to be buried. It lived on in courtrooms, in shelters, and in the quiet strength of others like her, still fighting to be heard.